B-Wing Starfighter. Anyone who witnessed the beginnings of my YouTube channel will surely remember this wide, blurry shot with a glaring desk in pine veneer. Quick, fleeting shots, hands overexposed by light, and finally frames sped up several times, where today I don't even know what I wanted to show you. That's exactly what the beginnings of my MrTrumpeter channel looked like at the turn of 2024 and 2025. But why am I coming back to this now, when today my channel is on a completely different level? Because I've finally closed the chapter I started this channel with and completed the B-Wing. According to my concept, this fighter had to make an emergency landing on Earth and only left it after a deep service at the American NASA headquarters. A quick note to start. This video is only the first of two parts of this story. I based it on materials from the first months of the channel. If you've already seen them, treat this episode as a quick synthetic summary. And if you're new here, it's a necessary introduction to the second part, which will feature modern quality and a specific advanced weathering tutorial. Visually, it's a bit of a time travel and boosted nostalgia, so I'll appreciate anyone who stays with me until the end of this episode, because without this introduction, it will be hard for you to understand the techniques I'll show in the final episode. But if videos recorded with a phone are not your thing and you prefer to wait for the second professional part, just take a look at the later moments of this video, and at the end, please leave a thumbs up and write in the comments, "I'm waiting for the second part." The YouTube algorithm loves that kind of activity. And click subscribe so you don't miss the finale, and now let's get started. The first challenge with this model was to create an imitation of the thermal shield surface used on spacecraft by NASA. The inspiration for all this fun was a space shuttle model built by John Chung, known under the pseudonym Scriber. Link in the description. To achieve this goal, I needed panel lines scribing tape, templates for scribing curved panels, thin brass sheets cut to size with a straight edge, a mechanical pencil, an olfa scalpel with a needle instead of a blade, Madworks scribers of various sizes, but mainly they were 0.125 millimeters and 0.2 millimeters, as well as sanding sponges of 600 grit, a brush with stiffer bristles to sweep away plastic particles, a scalpel, and Tamiya extra thin quick setting glue. I recorded 2 very long episodes on the channel about scribing panel lines itself, but for the purpose of this synthetic summary, I suggest a crash course. To start, I suggest applying a layer of primer to the plastic parts. There are several reasons. It's easier to draw with a pencil on the primer, and above all, the results of the work are more visible. In such cases, I often use a spray can primer because then I don't have to set up and dirty the airbrush. In the case of white plastic, like here, the primer was necessary to see anything at all. Another challenge was drawing the thermal panels using a normal-sized ruler, because the B-Wing's wing has many protruding elements. Today, I would use much smaller, more flexible, and handier Madworks mini modeling rulers for this purpose, but back then they weren't available yet, and I used the already mentioned hand-cut brass sheet strips. To create the thermal panels, I used the existing panel lines on the model and drew my own based on their layout. The characteristic texture of the thermal blankets that covered the upper parts of the space shuttles was done freehand using sheet templates and a 0.125 mm Madworks scriber. The method consisted of scribing parallel horizontal lines and then vertical ones, so that something like a grid was formed. An important rule to stick to is not to cover already scribed lines with the sheet, because then you can be sure that the lines won't be symmetrical to each other. The previously applied primer also helps in scribing as it increases the adhesion of the sheet to the scribed element and the scriber itself doesn't slip on the plastic. We have the thermal blankets scribed, but they still look more like a grid notebook than the surface of a spacecraft. First, remember to thoroughly sweep the plastic residue out of the scribed grooves. Then, smooth the newly created edges. I used a flexible sanding sponge for this. We sweep the dust out of the grooves again, and finally flood everything with Tamiya extra thin quick setting glue to smooth the edges and make the whole thing more plastic. To make this effect more natural, this process should be repeated 1 or 2 more times after the glue has fully dried. But for me, the effect was satisfactory after the first time. To scribe the characteristic thermal tiles that were mounted on the bottom and edges of the space shuttle, where the temperatures during atmospheric entry were the highest, I used 5mm wide panel line scribing tape, because this was the easiest way for me to maintain exactly the same spacing between the lines. As a measuring tape, I used a piece of the same tape, of which I weakened the glue, and after applying it to the first line, I stuck another one right next to it. Here, due to working on a curved element and a higher risk of the scriber slipping to the side and damaging the model's surface, I decided to first pre-scribe the line with an olfa needle, and only after preparing the material this way, scribe the line with a scriber. I also made the same cubes on the trailing edge and on the entire bottom surface of the wing. After these treatments, I primed both wings, and thanks to this, we can compare the version before and after scribing. What do you think? Was it worth the trouble? Before we move on to the cockpit, a short guide on how to get a gunmetal color on various types of pistols and cannons in 5 minutes. And yes, I know, it's not a rifle, but a blaster. First, we need to paint the parts with matte black paint. Remember that for matte paints, we use a fast-drying thinner with a drying accelerator, such as Mr. Color Rapid Thinner from Mr. Hobby. Next, using a medium-hard brush, we rub a metallic pigment in gunmetal color into the matte base. Remember to put a piece of paper towel on the mat, because most of the rubbed pigment will fall off, and if you don't do this, you will certainly get metallic pigment all over everything. Finally, we can highlight the edges of our weapon with graphite from a pencil. A soft one, like 2B, will work best here, but a hard one will also work. And watch out! It's best to do this after assembling the model parts, because using varnish will dull the metallic effect, and without protection, both the pigment and graphite are fragile, and it's better not to touch them without gloves. If this is impossible in your case, remember to touch up this effect after assembling the model parts. To paint the cables and several modules in the cockpit, I decided to try the Real Color series acrylic markers, which were a novelty back then. These markers work great in many places where until now the only solution was to use a brush. I'm not sure if I should have used them to paint hard-to-reach cables, but for larger and more protruding elements, they are a really great solution. I painted the remaining cockpit details and the pilot figure traditionally with a brush using a wet palette. To give the figure a bit more depth, I applied a wash made of a mix of graphite ink, glaze medium, and water over the whole thing. Using the dry brush method, I also highlighted the edges of the cockpit elements using paints such as light gray and brown chipping color. The 1:72 scale in which this model was produced doesn't tolerate such close-ups well, but thanks to them, you can judge the final effect before washing the whole thing. As a wash, I used black panel liner from Tamiya here and washed off the excess with a brush moistened in oil thinner from Modeler's World. Since the cockpit is quite tight and most of it is occupied by the pilot figure anyway, I decided there was no point in spending more time on it. We have the cockpit ready for painting, and taking advantage of the fact that there were two windshields in the set, I glued the one I won't use with ultra glue. Thanks to this, it can be easily removed later. I won't say much about painting with the base color here because the quality of the material makes everything white anyway, and the whole thing looks as if I were painting with water. Although some differences between the shades of white in the close-ups are noticeable. I painted the tip of the pilot capsule in the characteristic checkerboard pattern known, among others, from the Saturn V rocket. I painted the black thermal panel covers with a more muted black, blue-black, with subsequent admixtures of white to differentiate individual panels. I didn't mask anything, I just painted freehand panel by panel. And while we're on the subject of painting, it's worth mentioning that this entire model was painted with the excellent Universal Madworks JM00 airbrush in the ultimate version with 0.35 and 0.5mm nozzles. I painted the metallic parts of the model with several colors of my favorite metallic paints, Mr. Super Metallic, and to dilute them, I of course used the dedicated rapid thinner and the Madworks JM00 airbrush with a 0.35 nozzle. The Super Metallic series paints have the property of mixing perfectly with the C series, and thanks to this, we can expand this rather narrow color palette virtually at will. For the tubes, I decided to try a metallic marker from Stettler in a, rose gold color, and I must admit that the effect is quite satisfactory. Do you still remember when I said I glued the canopy with ultra glue? Well, look how nicely it comes off. Just scrape off the glue residue with a fingernail or tweezers, and you can mount the canopy permanently. It was also appropriate to give some life to this giant fuselage, so also without masking, I repainted selected panels using the post-shading technique, using transparent layers and colors quite close to the base color. Sometimes a bit lighter, sometimes darker. The difference is slight but noticeable. And let's remember that the main point of this work is to be the elements after service at NASA, and I didn't want the rest to distract from them in particular. I painted the blue invasion stripes characteristic of the B-Wing using the classic pre-shading technique. First, I used the base color for this, and a moment later, adding a bit of black to the blue paint, I boosted the contrast where I wanted to have more shadow or planned some larger accumulation of dirt. Since the pre-shading is ready, we can move on to painting. By applying the paint in an irregular way, we will obtain a visually more natural appearance of the painted surface. As you can see, by painting this way, I managed to get a quite natural and subtle local darkening effect. I decided to paint the equally characteristic orange circles from hand-cut masks. For this purpose, I used the cheapest available Dspiae compass and cut the masks themselves in 18mm Tamiya tape. And here's a little tip. Always remember, when masking a model, to press the masking tape with a toothpick so that it adheres to the panel lines. Otherwise, you risk the paint seeping under, and then you certainly won't get away without quite time-consuming corrections. I painted the circles in a similar way to the invasion stripes. This time, however, I tried to make the whole thing look faded and a bit worn. Therefore, I didn't want to create a completely opaque layer during painting. I think I did it best on the upper part of the fuselage, but the most important thing for me is that all three circles differ slightly from each other in saturation and color. My essentials for working with decals are a round synthetic brush with long bristles, Tamiya decal adhesive under the decals, and micro-scale micro-sole on the decals. And of course, cotton swabs. The process is quite simple. I place the decals on a very wet palette, apply decal adhesive to the model in the meantime, blot the excess water on a paper towel. I slide the decals onto the model with a brush or finger and also adjust them with a brush if necessary. And then, rolling a swab over the decal, I remove the excess water. After about a minute, I brush the area with microsol and repeat this step 2 to 3 more times at intervals of a few minutes. I leave the decals prepared this way for a minimum of 24 hours so that the applied chemistry does its job with them. Working with homemade decals or those made by small manufacturers is a bit different because in such decals, the film is applied to the entire sheet and must be cut before dipping the decal in water. I use a metal ruler and a sharp scalpel for this. After that, everything goes the same way. You just have to be more careful, because such decals are usually much thinner and more fragile, which you can probably already see. Fortunately, I had many more of these markings printed than I needed, so a patch in the form of a cut-up red stripe from another US flag on the sheet was enough. In the case of these decals, I also recommend waiting a minimum of 24 hours after applying the softening liquids. Since there were custom decals, we have custom masks. Both these markings that I'm painting on the B-Wing now and the decals I showed a moment ago are the original markings that were on the Saturn V rocket during the Apollo mission. Remember to paint the markings in thin and transparent layers. It's better to apply 5 or 6 of these layers than to regret a poor effect and flooded letters later. After drying, the kit decals visibly stood out, so a generous layer of clear coat and more was necessary. But I've already prepared a separate episode about this, so if you're curious about how to eliminate the decal film, you'll find the link somewhere on the screen now and of course also in the description. The B-Wing is already painted and ready for weathering, so if you've made it to this point with me, thank you very much and talk to you soon in the second part of this report. Please leave a thumbs up, a comment, and a share if you're watching this episode on a phone, which of course I don't recommend. And remember that the second part will already have cinematic quality. See you. Bye.